in verse 2 when we talked about, the husband of one wife. Paul wasn't meaning that to be, to exclude somebody from a leadership responsibility because he was not married. And in the same sense here, it's not excluding him because he doesn't have children. It just gives us a better picture, if he has a wife and he does have children, of how he's going to be a leader in the church. Okay? This teknon generally talks about a small child, okay? A child who's going to be under a certain age. This is more of a cultural thing because at that particular time, when did a man really become a man?
12.
About 13 years old. 13 years old, okay, is when he became a man. So when we see this teknon here, it's probably, in this particular instance, referring to that person, okay, that's less than that age, okay? Now, is it difficult to manage children who are less than 12 years old? Can I get an amen there? All right, so that's our teknon. And like I say, as far as age, it doesn't say anything specific here, but given the cultural climate at the time, anybody that was less than 13 years of age was probably considered a teknon. The next word we hit was echo, and actually it should be pronounced more echo, almost like Ahmed in the Arabic. Got ahead of myself. And this word basically is one of our verbs in this particular passage, and it's in the present active participle. So once again, present tense, we got action going on here. To stand in a close relationship to someone, to have, basically can mean to control, okay? And that's our word here actually in our passage. In verse 4, if you look at it, keeping his children under control. Under control. And that gives us our last word, this under control. Hupotage, and basically that word means a state of submissiveness, subjection, subordination, as opposed to one setting himself up as a controller. As a controller. So this word is directed towards these children. This is how they should control them. And it's not, like I say, this domineering, authoritative kind of presence here is what they're talking about, but it's more, once again, standing in front of them and leading them by example. Okay? Does that mean that correction is not required? Sure, it is required from time to time. All right? Children must yield to the headship of their father just as a wife submits to her husband. And we see that in Philippians 2:11. Paul wrote elsewhere that a pastor should have faithful children not accused of riot or unruly. And we see this in Titus 1:6, where it's also talking about the overseer as well. The children must be believers who are not insubordinate. Okay? And in Titus 1:6, we do see that there is a reference to them being believers. Okay? So we talked a little bit about Proverbs, and what does Proverbs tell us about training children? So if you would, let's make a little journey over to Proverbs. In verse 20 is where we'll start. Verse 20. Oh, I'm sorry. Chapter 20. Thank you, Terry. I do need that help from time to time to stay on track. So Proverbs chapter 20, looking at verse 11. It is by his deeds that a lad distinguishes himself, if his conduct is pure and right. So what does that tell you?
Well, apparently.
And a hush fell over the crowd. That tells us that, you know, there's some equal opportunity here, right? It's not just us leading the children by our example, correcting them when we need to, but also it's a good thing for them when people see them behaving in a manner worthy of the child of God. Okay? And that's my take on that passage. Let's go to 22:6, one of my favorite passages. 22:6. In fact, I think they made a song about this one. About teach children. All right, sorry. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Can anybody think about a story that's in the Bible that basically talks about that verse? The prodigal son. Classic example. Okay? Classic example. We have a responsibility to train up our children in the way of the Lord. That does not exactly mean that when they get older, they'll stay with that training, does it? So we go back to my question that I asked before. Does this mean that when a child becomes a man and goes off the deep end, we should run off our leaders? No. We've done our part because the training should start when they're young. Okay? Got to ingrain it into their heads so hopefully sometime down the road they'll remember the teaching that you did teach them. 22:15, well, we're in the same spot, drop down a couple of verses there. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him. I call that exercising the demons. In Proverbs 23, starting at verse 13. 23, starting in verse 13. Do not hold back discipline from the child. Although you strike him with the rod, he will not die. Just exercising the demons. You shall strike him with the rod and rescue his soul from Sheol. My son, is your heart, if your heart is wise, my own heart will be glad. So what does that tell you? That we delight in seeing that our kids get it and that they behave properly. And my innermost being will rejoice when your lips speak what is right. Do not let your heart envy sinners, but live in the fear of the Lord always. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Listen, my son, and be wise, and direct your heart in the way. Do not be with heavy drinkers of wine, or with gluttonous eaters of meat. For the heavy drinker and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe one with rags. Listen to your father who begat you, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Buy truth and do not sell it. Get wisdom and instruction in understanding. The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he who sires a son or wise son will be glad in him. Let your father and your mother be glad, and let her rejoice who gave birth to you. Give me your heart, my son, and let your eyes delight in my ways. And finally, if you look at Proverbs 29:15, where it says, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame on his mother. Why does it bring shame on his mother?
She made him get away.
Well, at that time, who was basically raising the children while the men went off to work? Okay? And I'm sure anybody who's been to Walmart or someplace like that and watched children just basically walk all over their parents. know exactly what I'm talking about, okay? If we let it, give them an inch, that old said nature will take a mile, okay? So, but a child who is left to himself brings shame to his mother. Brings shame to his mother. All right, what about the children's responsibility? Let's go back to the New Testament, and let's look at Ephesians 6. Do children have responsibility in this? And the answer should be, yes, they do.
Yes, they do.
In Ephesians 6, it says family relationships. That's the pericope right above that, the little heading for this particular chapter or the particular section of this chapter. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which was the first commandment, with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. So is that like a threat that will kill you if you don't? No. It may scare you into it. Fathers, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Let's drift a little bit more past Philippians and land on Colossians chapter 2, verse 20 and 21. And if you have died with Christ to the elementary, no, I did that wrong again. It was 3, wasn't it? Yeah. I didn't fix that in my notes. Shame on me. 3:20. 3:20. Or actually 3:18. Let's start in 3:18. Wives, be subject to your husbands as it is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. And once again, fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. So we see that twice, that fathers are not supposed to crunch their children, basically. Once again, we're leading by what? By example, okay? By example. All right. Our last little word here, going back to our passage, 1 Timothy 3, is the last little phrase there of the end of the verse where it says, with all dignity, with all dignity. And it's an odd place really to put it there, but this is a reflection of that person. He is, at this particular point in time, we've gone back and we've looked at a lot of this points back to the person that we're talking about here. We're talking about the overseer. In some places we're talking about the deacons, but bottom line we're talking about leadership in the church. Okay? So how should they do this controlling of their children? And that's where our last little phrase here comes from, and that basically means with all dignity, with all dignity. And I'm going to give you kind of a little expanded definition of this from a lexicon. It's a manner or mode of behavior that indicates one is above what is ordinary and therefore worthy of special respect. Did you get that? Above what is ordinary and therefore worthy of special respect. I think that's a beautiful translation of what dignity, which is semnotes in the Greek. And this prepositional phrase, as I said, refers back to the person that is controlling those children. They're doing it with dignity. They're leading from the front and by example. It is characteristics of adults that should be manifested by deacons. We see that in 3:8 of our passage there. Wives of deacons in 3:11, and also aged men in Titus 2:2. And that would be more like parents and grandparents. How about that? Believers should live with such honest dignity in 1 Timothy 2:2, and should think upon honest things as we see in Philippians 4:8. And these are both the same words that you see here.